This morning's program is intended to terrify you. So buckle up. If you weren't scared by our last conversation, we like to end on a really positive note. So I'm going to start with Nate Halverson here, the subject of The Grab, which many of you watched on Tuesday night. Was that Monday night? Monday night.
Yeah, what even day is it, right?
Who knows?
Yeah.
So Nate, can you, for those, in case there's anyone here who didn't see The Grab, can you give us basically just like an overview of what you're seeing in the water rights situation, and specifically international groups and corporate groups grabbing water around the U.S.?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of folks that have identified water, which is used 70 to 80% to produce food, as one of the key limiting resources going forward, limiting and destabilizing resources going forward. And so there's been a concerted effort by sovereign wealth funds, by private equity, by government actors to begin to buy up those resources to secure their futures, or to use those resources geopolitically as a stratagem to control other countries' decision kind of framework. So that was sort of the larger kind of picture of the film.
Who are the most significant actors in that space that you're seeing?
Well, the countries that need the resources, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, China, they've all been prodigious purchasers of food assets, and food, is representing virtual water. So if you think about it, if your country doesn't have enough water to meet its domestic needs, what you do is you don't go and buy a bunch of Exxon Valdez tankers and ship water from one place to another. It's just the water demands are too large for that actually to be economically feasible. Here in California, during a drought of, I think, 1990-91, San Luis Obispo was running really short on water, and the city was actually talking about trying to tow icebergs down, and to bring water in this way. But really the way that you deal with water shortages is by bringing food in, because food is about 70 to 80% of the water that you're going to use. And so what you do is you go to the country that has the water, you grow the food in that place. If you want to be really efficient, you feed that food to animals, and then you ship the animals back, because animals are very deep concentration of water. So the most water effective movement is actually the movement of meat. And I liked your question you asked the panel. And my response would have been, when the U.S. did its national intelligence estimate in 2012 on water, and that's the highest intelligence product the U.S. government does. They bring in all of the different intelligence communities to work on it. The U.S. Air Force colonel who was working at the CIA, who led that endeavor, who, interestingly, Maria Otero, who is the Undersecretary of State, had asked the CIA to do this, and the CIA laughed at her, and they said, "We work on real things." And so she had to go back to Secretary Clinton, and who could order the CIA to do it. And
apparently the CIA doesn't like drinking water.
Well, they just didn't think it was a real issue. And they came back and they said, mea culpa. This is a huge international concern. And in that report, when they were releasing it, he said that meat consumption at the rate we're heading is going to destabilize the world, and we can't continue as business as usual. And we heard the same thing from Nestle. Am I going maybe too long now? But I'll finish on this. I'll just say that in a classified cable I got where the U.S. Embassy went to Switzerland and did a tour of the Nestle headquarters, the chief economist of Nestle said, if the rest of the world ate as much meat per capita as America does, we would have run out of fresh water in the year 2000.
Wow.
And that's the world's largest private food company saying that,
All right. Okay. So that's scary. Ben, you run an organization called Grow the Flow. Can you tell us a little bit more? You're based in Salt Lake. You're focused on saving the Great Salt Lake. Can you tell us a little bit more about why that's so important, and what the role that Salt Lakes around the world also play in water scarcity and water supply?
Yeah, thanks, Berit. Half of the world's lake water occurs in these saline lakes. So we think of them as odd ecosystems, but it's a full half of global lake water. They're extremely important. They occur in arid and semi-arid issues. And what I think is interesting about these lakes is they are a microcosm of water security at a global scale. So when you have overconsumption of water, you see the lake go down, right? About 60% of global saline lake area has already been lost, and that's irrigated agriculture. So it's food, right? So we're seeing, in the case of Great Salt Lake, this used to be the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere. It's now number 2. Mar Chiquita in Argentina is now larger, so the rivalry between the U.S. and Argentina continues. We have to make our lake great again and grow the flow. I'm an ecologist, so I've studied the degradation of ecosystems around the world, the impact on people, the impact on wildlife, on land and water itself. And we decided about 2 years ago that we had to do more than just describe the death of another ecosystem. So Grow the Flow is working to bring together the policy experts, the private capital, the scientists, the public, the religious community. We're predominantly members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the watershed there, to really have a tidal wave to be the first community anywhere in the world to save their saline lake. So of the 120 large saline lakes in the world, all of them are in decline, except for one on the Tibetan Plateau, which is filling up because of melting glaciers. So not exactly what we want to model the
exactly
rescue
the bright spot we were hoping for.
That's right. So we're hoping to be a world first in showing we can establish water security on this medium scale, right, with a few million people.
And can I add like a 15-second addendum there, which is that California used to be home to the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi in the Central Valley, and it disappeared by the end of the 19th century because of agricultural diversions. That lake is gone. So the idea that this is theoretical, that it might happen, isn't accurate. It has happened. It's happened here in California.
Right. The lakes are mostly gone.
Mm-hmm.
So, Paul, you are a water rights attorney. You work directly with the communities that are affected by water scarcity. Can you give us an understanding of what are some of the key issues that you're seeing in your practice?
So, I'm a water rights attorney in Colorado. I also practice in New Mexico. And my practice has been representing 8 cities, a couple counties, agricultural communities. And the biggest problem we have is so obvious. I mean, water is becoming more scarce and demands are growing. And so a big part of my practice has been to develop water conservation plans. Because a little known fact, this is a very educated group, maybe you all know this, but every drop of water that you use at your home, 95% of that returns to the river. So the biggest use of water right now is for food, but for the residential users, it's their outdoor irrigation. So there's many, many ways to conserve water. And then what I've done, though, is I've gone ahead and expanded my practice, and I'm assisting tribes, Native Americans, to secure their water. They have the most senior water rights in every water basin, and what I love about this conference, you guys, is I'm not a data or a misinformation guy, but that is what's really hurting them. They've been misinformed for decades. So they're living on these reservations. They have to truck in, drinking water, but they have more rights to the water than agriculture around them. So that's my main goal right now, is to assist these tribes to secure their water.
Awesome. All right. Going to Tom. Tom, you are the COO and CFO at a company called Membrion. Can you tell us a little bit about the problem that you are trying to solve at Membrion?
Sure. Membrion is trying to solve the problem of hazardous waste from industrial sites. And so think of your cell phone. It's full of critical minerals. It's full of metals that have been mined, refined, used in the process to build the phone, and then when it's recycled, those metals again will go back into a watershed. And typically it's in an acidic waste stream. So Membrion has developed a proprietary way of taking acidic wastewater and separating the metal ions from the water using electricity. And so this is something that some of our investors like Samsung and Lam Research, they want it for their semiconductor fabs so they can shrink the amount of hazardous waste they put into the watershed. And 400 million tons a year of hazardous waste gets dumped into the watershed, and then it pollutes water that is really, really hard to clean up. So we'd rather clean it up at the point of source and then allow the water that we clean to be reused and then the metals to be recovered. And so many companies, such as Samsung, for example, have mandates for critical minerals in order to recapture the critical minerals and make us, safer or reuse them. And I think that was when watching the grab. If you saw, there was one slide in there or one shot which it showed, food, water, but it also had the minerals as far as the targets for critical minerals as the targets for these companies that were buying up plots of land and buying up rights. And we see that as an area where the U.S. is extremely vulnerable to having our own supply.
So I think what we're seeing here is we're facing both like an extreme scarcity and a scarcity that will continue to increase in the years to come. A struggle over who owns water, right? Which is a struggle that, Paul, you're gonna be employed for the rest of your life in that pursuit. And then also, the purity of water, right? So what are we doing with the water that we have? Can we continue to drink it? Can we continue to use it for its various purposes? And what does that look like when we aren't able to do that? I'm curious, I brought this up yesterday with Ben on the bus back, but I was asking about, well, what about desalination? Like, is that a viable response? Do you want to dive into that a bit?
As Paul mentioned, I think on the drinking water side, absolutely. We're talking about a tiny amount of water. When we are
1/10 of 1%, I calculated it.
1/10 of 1% is drinking water.
Of the water that we use is for drinking.
Yeah.
So on the drinking water side, urban water use, indoor, for sure. When we start talking about food, we are consuming the equivalent of half of the entire water that flows from the land to the ocean every year. The flows of water are enormous. There's no scenario where we can continue the food patterns that we have right now through a technological fix like desalination. It's conservation. It's changing human behavior. So the two ways that you get to security are either increasing supply or decreasing demand. And we've got huge room for improvement on decreasing demand.
But let's just step back from desal, because the idea of desal is that a technology is going to step in and fix the issue. And so I think the one thing you have to keep in mind that people, I can't remember if it was at the State Department or the intelligence community, but what somebody said to me is have you heard of the Jevons effect? I said, no. And he said the Jevons effect goes back to coal production and consumption in the industrial age, and people thought as factories and other uses of coal became more efficient, we'd see consumption decline, and instead, as the marginal cost of coal use declined, consumption skyrocketed. And Ben and I were having a side conversation, and I said, has anyone looked at this in water? And he said, yes, here are the peer-reviewed studies. And so what you've seen is actually as the technology gets better, as it becomes more water efficient, it becomes cheaper to use, and you can use it in more industries, and actually water consumption increases. So you can't actually solve the problem just with technology alone.
So what is the solution? Did anyone on this panel have thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Ben.
Tom?
Well, I guess I think it's a combination. I think the least expensive way is on the front end. You need to conserve. And going back to the desal discussion, desalination is extremely energy intensive. When you look at it compared to just conserving, you're going to have an enormous amount of energy just to do the desal. One of the advantages of our technology is that it takes less energy per gallon of water once you reach a certain type of water. But it's still you're basically trying to work against entropy. You're trying to separate some material from another material, and would rather be together. And then on the consumption side, I think you're really going to have to monitor how people are pricing it. What is it for them? What is it costing them, or what are they getting from it? Because I think especially for ag, they're literally at the pennies of what they're sensitive to on pricing. And if they see the marginal cost of water is lower for them to use ditch water versus conserving, they're going to use the ditch water. They need to have some type of economic incentive in order to see a better tomorrow, rather than just a promise of you'll make a lot of people in the city feel better, but you'll lose some money.
But the one challenge, I think, just economically real quick is, I talked to Stuart Wolf, who's one of the largest almond growers in the Central Valley, and the issue becomes as water prices go up, you don't necessarily then start growing the crop that uses the least amount of water. You start growing the crop that has the highest profit margins. Even if it means that you ultimately know that the water's going to run out, you have to grow the crop that actually is going to be profitable. So that becomes almonds in the Central Valley, in Yemen, which a lot of people on the inside will tell you was a water war, that started as a water war. What ended up happening is water became more and more scarce. They started using it to grow more and more khat, which is essentially a stimulant drug that people chew in that community. And so the water went down even faster. So water pricing also isn't just a silver bullet.
And
Paul, do you have any ideas?
yeah, so I mean, I think I might have a few. No, I work with the agricultural community a lot. And as you said, I mean, we've got to incentivize conservation. And the only way to incentivize it is economically. So Colorado has actually got programs now to incentivize water conservation. But you hit it on the head that, farmers, if it's cheaper to just run a ditch where most of the water evaporates, they'll do that. So we've got to find ways to bring technology into agriculture and make it worthwhile for the agricultural community. The other thing, too, you guys, on water quality, a little known fact, Colorado, I think, is very representative of the West, but every drop of water is reused at least 10 times going down the river. And Ben, I'm sure you're aware of that. It's so yeah, water treatment is also absolutely imperative. Yeah.
Ben, we've talked a lot today on stage about appealing to farmers and talking to farmers. You're working directly with farmers. What have you seen is successful in your kind of policy related efforts?
There are a lot of farmers who are responsive to market mechanisms, right? So once you have a program in place that's offering, if you conserve water, we'll buy it for environmental flows or for anything else. There absolutely is a part of the community too that is really scared, right, and suspicious. And so even when that economic signal is there, it's a way of life. It's an identity. And that's where this is, again, a collective action problem. Where I see the biggest role of innovation and technology playing is how do we move people's hearts and minds, right? How do we get people in this time of unprecedented distrust to work together to participate in these programs?
We need the marketing team on board.
We need the
we need
marketing
Pendulum
team
to come
That's
back
right.
and help us out.
I really think so. It's not a water problem. It's a people problem. And there are plenty of resources if we can use them in a wise way.
So, Tom, I want to go back to you and talk a little bit more about Membrion. So you're a very specific solution for mostly industrial water use, which, and just by the way, for those of you who don't know, the solution before Membrion was shipping water across long distances, recycling it, and then sending it back. So Membrion actually eliminates a lot beyond just removing the metal from the water. It's also cutting down a lot on carbon emissions and reduction and carbon life cycle. But are there other solutions similar to Membrion that you're seeing out there that you think are interesting or people should be aware of?
I mean, just thinking about water treatment in general, I think there are a lot of breakthrough technologies for PFAS, for example, and we talked a little bit about that today. And what we know is a little bit hard to detect, actually fairly hard to eliminate, but relatively easy to capture if you have the right matrix, et cetera. But one of the challenges is, at the beginning of this year, new administration, they basically froze all new mandates. And so they said, you're not going to do this, regardless of where it was. So EPA was under that. About 2 months later, it was like, we're going to review what the PFAS regulations are and essentially reduce them. And now they're trying to redefine it between, it used to be down to, I think, a fairly small molecular chain, and now it's going to be only the long ones. And so one of the challenges on the technology side is you have very well-positioned, innovative, small companies. One was just, I think, purchased by Veralto, which is a large conglomerate of water treatment, but now they see no market because that market has literally been taken away from them because there will be no regulation to incentivize people to actually treat it. And so it went away from all municipal wastewater treatments will eventually come in and remove PFAS. People found technology to do that. But now it's going to turn to, well, maybe it's only the industrial users that need to do it. It's going to really distort the market. So I do think as new, challenges come up, there is technology to address it, but it needs to be in concert with regulatory frameworks that sort of allow companies to say, I'm doing this not only because it's the right thing to do, but because I'll get fined if I don't do it. There needs to be that combination motivation, because
the punishment has to match
companies aren't going to do it out of the goodness of their heart.
Yeah.
If it's a less expensive way of doing it, though, we'll do it because in many of the companies' minds, the shareholders rule. But we have to have a way of regulatory frameworks and then matching that technology. But I would say that PFAS over the last, say, 3 or 4 years has been really the breakthrough technology where there have been many, many companies really seeing that as the next big market to make the water supply safer.
I'm curious, and Paul, I'll start with you just because of your legal background, but if anyone else has thoughts on this, I would love to hear them as well. Are there examples from other places around the world of countries or communities that are doing a good job of regulating their water use, or that are have put effective policy regulations into place?
I really think the United States is leading the way. I'm not really familiar with the structures in Europe, but as Nate put forth in his film, I mean, so much of the world is just a wreck trying to regulate water. For the West, we have the systems in place that we really can account for every drop, pretty much. And then you contrast that with what Nate looked at in Africa, where it's just the militias coming in and taking water,
Paul, could I push back, though? I mean, Colorado River, Great Salt Lake, Salton Sea, depletion of groundwater nationally. If we're doing the best, we're in trouble.
And I'm not saying we're not in trouble.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that we're probably the most regulated, and we're still losing water.
So Israel is held up often as a leader, right? So they consume 6 times less water per capita than we do in the U.S. on average. They've got a completely nationalized water system.
Yeah.
So it's not. They do. Everybody pays the same amount for water, whether you're using it to take a shower or grow food.
And
right?
Huge desalination.
And the Dead Sea continues to drop, right? So they're not doing it either. But
Tom,
I was reaching for something positive here, Berit.
Just thinking about it, I think Europe has very strict controls over their watershed and their water use. I'm not sure it always leads to the best, outcomes. And the example, I gave a little bit of it yesterday, but the example is currently Perrier is having issues where they're treating their water to remove E. coli. Well, it turns out that since 2009 in Europe, if you have something that you call mineral water, you can't treat it that way. You can't use UV, you can't use microfiltration. So there's this enormous pushback where some within France are saying, you have to follow the law. And others are saying, hey, this is a big company. If we follow the law, we're going to lose a lot of market capital. But they're basically, something like 40% of all, mineral water sources in France are being surreptitiously treated by UV, by microfiltration to make them safer for consumers. Now, the flip side is, do we really need bottled water? Absolutely not. In the US, maybe a few percentage, especially in rural areas in, the Sierras, or there's some places where arsenic is a big issue. You need to have bottled water. But the US and Mexico are 2 countries that spend more on bottled water than we do on our domestic water supply. And 99% of the people, it doesn't give them a health benefit.
And I'm going to jump in, and because I feel like I've been only negative, I just want to reiterate that this is solvable, right? This is a totally solvable issue. The engineers can solve it. Regulators can solve it. We just need everyone working in concert. Like, part of the solution will be technology. Part of the solution will definitely be re-upping the regulatory framework, because the regulatory framework in the U.S. largely comes from a period when water was abundant. And like in Israel, that decided water was a national security issue, and so they began redeveloping their regulatory framework. If the U.S. doesn't do that, if the world doesn't come together and do that, then we're going to be in trouble. So then you just have to ask yourself, is the U.S., our lawmakers capable of doing it? And there's your real sticking point.
But it's easier to stop doing something than to start doing something. Maybe. I don't know. And one of the things that we could stop doing that would have an immense impact local to global scales is stop subsidizing animal agriculture, right? The reason why Great Salt Lake is declining is because of the Farm Bill. The reason why farmers in the desert are growing alfalfa, which takes as much water as rice, is because that's a crop that they can sell on a national and international market, right? So let's stop distorting the market and start supporting it.
And for those who saw the film, Edward Hargroves, who runs one of the largest agricultural investment firms in the U.S., he has a lot of traditional agricultural farms, and then he got into regenerative agriculture. And he said, the government will subsidize me so much better to do it the old, wrong way than they will to do it the way that we should be doing it. And so we have in place these frameworks that continue to incentivize behavior that the science community, intelligence community, others are saying, if you continue down that path, we're all going to be in a lot of trouble. But that's where the subsidies continue.
All right, we have a couple of minutes left for questions. So if anyone has a question, please come up to the microphone. And let's start with you.
Just a quick follow-up with that. Isn't part of the pushback Big Ag, who creates the seeds and doesn't want the farmers to switch to more organic methods?
Absolutely. So thinking from the corporate side, and we discussed this a little bit, the best way to solve these water problems is the most expensive way, right? So the more water that's being consumed, the more canals, pipelines, cloud seeding that you need, the better. So no, I think that we're really working against the at some level, Big Ag and regulatory capture.
Hari?
Yes. Great panel. Thank you very much. I was really surprised by the statistic that less than 1/10 of drinking water. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. There is this really crazy, rotten movie called Water back in 1984, Michael Caine. And the biggest joke was these guys from Texas, they're looking at a gallon of gas at some exorbitant cost, and they can sell a gallon of water at twice the cost.
Right.
And it's like, if drinking water is so limited, and if most of the diseases, waterborne diseases like malaria and everything in developing countries, or when a tsunami happens, isn't that a simple problem that one could solve?
In the U.S., it's marketing. I mean, you go back and you see where Nestle, Perrier, all the groups came in and started marketing mineral water. Americans weren't drinking it. Now we're the number one consumer in the world. So it's a different problem, I think, in the U.S., where I would argue we have very safe drinking water. In Europe, there is as well. In Africa, it's a little bit different. If you want to have, sterile water, you have to do something to it. There's some simple things like you put it in a bottle, put it on your roof for a day, and the UV from the sunlight can kill it if it's a transparent bottle. So there's ways of doing it where you're not paying the surtax to a mineral water provider. But it is different for different parts of the world of how valuable that is to the community and to the individual.
And is that what your company is thinking about? Who is thinking?
We think about industrial waste contaminating water supplies, so we want to keep the water supplies clean. There's other groups thinking about how to provide
I just want to say, yes, it is a simple problem to solve, drinking water. It is shameful that we have not solved it. 1.8 million people die prematurely every year from water pollution, right? That is something that is an economic and moral failure, right? So yes, we should solve that problem first. Then when we think about the food system, it's 100 times more water.
All right, John has a question.
You mentioned Jevons effect and how the declining cost of any resource results in increased consumption. And we've been talking about how to undo some of the misguided water utilization effects of the past. Is anybody working on how to prevent what I see as fairly imminent in coastal communities of small nuclear fission reactors powering desalination, or ultimately fusion reactors more inexpensively powering desalination, and how we prevent the knock-on effects on coastal ecosystems of the increased salinity associated with desalination?
I'll just weigh in and say the amounts of water, even under these extreme scenarios, with almost free solar or nuclear energy, it's a very small amount of water. So I'm not saying that's not important, and for sure Tom would be more qualified.
I think the Arabian Sea is a good example, and they're seeing so much desal there that their salinity is raising 35, 40, 50 parts per thousand. It's a very warm environment as well, so it's basically becoming almost unlivable. So one thing that, again, very deep pockets, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they're looking at these large desal plants where they're essentially going to zero liquid discharge. So they're not discharging brine, They're basically taking it through microfiltration, and I think the manganese comes out there. They have a manganese ingot factory. You know, by the end, you have this huge pile of salt and these manganese ingots. And so in a confined ecosystem, the excess salinity will absolutely wreck the ecosystem. In the Pacific Ocean, I think we have less to worry about, but it obviously has to be thought about. I mean, it's more of a millennial issue or longer, but in confined spaces like the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, it absolutely has already been seen.
And the only caveat I would add to that is that if the dumping of the salt is not managed in a way that it doesn't get diluted by the Pacific Ocean through currents and so forth, it could still have very intense local impact through salinization.
All right, we are out of time, unfortunately. You guys maybe will hang out a little bit for extra questions.
Yeah, for sure. And I just wanted to say, give us $1.5 million so we can save the lake. Let's do it together. No.
I like it. He's a go-getter. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone.